Welcome to your Punctibyte for the week of January 28th. I will apologize for looking a bit disheveled tonight. We got in from a ski race very late, and then one of our athletes had a flat tire, so I'm bringing this Punctibyte to you a little later than usual. I do have a lot of cool things, though, to talk about and a lot of prep for an awesome week in lab. And let's begin with a little bit of what's in the news. A couple of stories on the H1N1 virus and how about 24% of the population is confirmed with cases of H1N1, which was nearing the prediction that they had made when they declared it a pandemic in 2009, July of 2009. Another thing that was in the news that I thought was kind of fun is the discovery of microbial life in storm clouds. And this is not necessarily new, the idea that microorganisms play a big role in weather, but what's interesting about this particular story is that they're talking about the difficulty of sampling microbial life from severely violent storm clouds. So that was kind of a fun and interesting story. Before I kick things off with what we're doing this week, there's just one thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about. All of you will be delivering your first lecture soon, if not this week, and I thought it would be a good time to go through and talk a little bit about some of the effective ways in which to deliver a lecture. And I'll probably come back to this again after you've gotten your feet wet a little bit and you've maybe discovered some of the things with which you struggle, so we can come back and talk about them again. But there's a few things that I'll share with you, beginning with the idea that preparation is absolutely paramount. You've got to know what it is that you're going to be talking about that day, and honestly, a lot of times that takes memorization. Not just memorization of the content of the lecture, but also memorization of the flow of the lecture. So what slide comes after what other slide often is a very, very helpful thing to have in your mind so that you don't find yourself pausing and being awkward in between slides. We've all been there when a professor is like, oh, and that slide, right? And you know, we're all guilty, but it certainly does help a lot to be a little bit prepared for that. The other thing that I find is super, super important is to keep in contact with your listener. Think about it as being a dynamic conversation with another person, as opposed to a disengaged delivery of a lecture. And it's terrible, that's what I've called this, right? It really does need to be more like a conversation. So you want to keep eye contact with your listeners so that you can see how they're feeling about the material. They feel more invested, too, in the conversation if they feel that you're maintaining eye contact with them. I think it's really important to personalize lectures, so relating your lecture to something that you do, something that you've seen in the current events, something that you're interested in, something you've studied in lab. But maybe even more important than relating to something that you do is relating to what your students know. So maybe you have somebody in the class who expresses interest in environmental issues. So maybe when we're talking about the water lecture, for example, we can talk about things that might relate to that particular person's interest. So, you know, we can say, Jeff, this is like when you're doing that in your life, and you can really engage that person. Be present. This is something that is so important. If you're not engaged with the lecture, your listener will not be engaged with the lecture. If you're off somewhere else thinking about last night's date or something, then your listener is also not going to be engaged in the conversation. So pay attention to the vibes that you get from your students. Make sure that you have that kind of engagement with them so that you can get a feel for whether they're understanding, whether they're confused, whether they're stressed. So really try to read not only their verbal language, but also their body language, and feel what they're thinking and whether they're understanding the material you're covering, because that's going to give you the best clue as to whether you need to go back and review or whether what you said was really very unclear. Become aware of your nervous habits. I had one TA who really liked to hold onto the side of the table and rock back and forth as they were lecturing. That's a particularly distracting habit to have. Also, verbal pauses. So maybe you're umming a lot or like a lot or something like that, right? That really does distract. Slow down. I've rarely seen a lecture that goes too slowly. well, it has happened on occasion, but it's very unusual. So I think it's a good idea to try to think about slowing down. People's habit is to go a little bit too fast. So other than that, I think I've covered most everything. I want to make sure that everybody feels free to interlace your own personality. I have a particular way of lecturing, and mine is bubbly, gregarious, very, very enthusiastic, maybe like sickeningly so, and that's not effective for everybody. I mean, really, all of you should consider going and watching one of your returning TA's lectures. Like, for example, Elia is phenomenal when it comes to being present in the lecture. James is amazing when it comes to interlacing his personality, which, unlike mine, is more of a dry sense of humor. It's very effective, however. Sarah and Amy are amazing at bringing in their prior knowledge, background, and experience. Erin is incredible when it comes to bringing in things that are like linguistics and roots of words and how those matter in your study. So all of my returning TAs, and I'm sorry if I did not mention one of you, all of you have beautiful things that you interlace into your lectures, and I think for our new TAs, it's a really good idea to go and visit with one of those returning TAs. Let's go ahead and talk about what's happening in lectures this week, or I should say in lab in general this week. I'll just briefly draw your attention to the calendar for this week so we can see what's up and coming. I already mentioned that Lab 3 is coming, where many of you will give your first lectures, but I also wanted to just draw attention quickly to the fact that T and Elia will be manning Open Lab this week. But then lastly, I also want to mention that on Thursday the 31st and Friday the 1st, I actually will be gone. I'm going to be taking the ski team to a big Division 1 race in New Mexico, so we'll be leaving early in the morning on the 31st. Chelsea Hoekstra will be there, and she will be taking my place. She is wicked cool. You guys are going to be upset when I come back because Chelsea is way cooler than I am, but treat her well and have a really good time on that day. Beginning with Lab 2, I know we already covered this on the last Punctibyte, but I just want to briefly remind you that you're going to want to demo the negative stain before we begin anything else. That can be tricky, so you need to be very clear with your students that that's what you're doing, and you need to really clearly explain what you're doing when they come into the room at the very beginning and all of a sudden everything seems out of sequence to them. So be very clear with that, and that Richard and Jacob, you can help with that in your sections, making sure that they understand why you're seemingly starting out of sequence. But it really helps so much for that stain to be able to dry prior to the lecture. I won't go into more details on this because we covered it on last week's Punctibyte, but I will talk just a little bit about Lab 3, which is the ever-important gram stain. So please don't forget to assign the gram stain report, and I think it's reasonable to have that gram stain report be due on February the 7th. My students do have an exam on February the 5th, but I think that it's a very small report. It's really only a 3-page effort, and I think that shouldn't be too much of a strain for them to get that done for February 7th. There are some nice notes in here on logistics behind the gram stain and just some background information for gram reaction. We may not have covered this yet in lecture, so please be very careful to cover it well in lab so that we can just simply build on it in lecture. There's an important aspect of demoing the difficult step in the gram stain, which is the decolorization. So make sure that you do a good job of showing them how that step works, because that is really the place where most gram stains go wrong. So if we can do a good job of explaining that right off the bat, that would be absolutely fantastic. Differentiate the gram stain as one kind of stain versus the acid-fast stain as a different kind of differential stain. And there's, again, some things added on here about acid-fast stains that you can read through in your own time. I'll briefly cover Lab 4 because I know that Elia and T will be going on to Lab 4 this week. So on this one, we'll be finishing off our our differential stains. And I think on this day it's really very important not only to help your students as they identify their unknowns, we need to keep track of that and to make sure that we're giving them the species name as well as their genus name so that they can write a good press release. With that press release, we'll want to assign that in such a way that it's not unclear that it is a different assignment than the gram stain report. LINT, we can talk about unique deadlines for your lab as needed. So for the endospore and capsule stains, they're pretty straightforward procedures, but we may want the students to begin their capsule smear prior to the lecture because it too takes a while to dry. So go ahead and have them make that capsule smear. It's just a couple of loopfuls of the milk culture or even just a single loopful of the milk culture onto the slide prior to the lecture so that it can dry during that lecture. So a lot of good information and background on both the endospore and capsule stain, but also don't forget to have your students go back to the back of the room and look at the flagella stain demo. That demo will be just that, a demo. They're not going to perform the flagella stain, but it will allow them to see the last of the types of differential stains. Lastly, for Lab 4, you want to make sure that the students are ready for Lab 5 because it is the dilution problems. And particularly for medical micro students, these are very difficult. Some of them are not on a math track. Some of them haven't had math in many years. So drawing their attention to scientific notation and exponential notation and how that works, it can be a journey for them. So making sure that we're clear on how we explain that. For Richard and Jacob, this is something that it's really important for you guys to be super prepared in order to show them on the board how to work through the different methods for dilution. All right, I think that's a wrap tonight, and I'm gonna go get some sleep.